Welcome back to App Stories. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, of course, is Federico Viticci. Federico, how are you today?
Hello, John. I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
Very, very good. I want to let everybody know that we've got 3 sponsors for this episode. That's Pillow, Masterclass, and Trade. We've also got a very special guest with us today. We've got David Smith. How are you, David?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. I mean, Dave's obviously the developer of Widgetsmith, Pedometer++, Sleep++, and a bunch of other apps. And I guess it was a couple of episodes, Federico, a couple episodes ago that you and I talked about Widgetsmith in connection with all the new iOS 16 lock screen widgets. And I was trying to remember the story about how Widgetsmith originally blew up when it was first released. And I'd remembered Dave talking at some point about how he was not at home, he was with his family, and it all blew up, and his family kind of pitched in and helped him. But I couldn't remember exactly what the timeline was. But after that episode, Dave got in touch with us to kind of fill in the details. And I thought it would be fun to just kick off this episode and to talk to Dave a little bit about the history of Widgetsmith and exactly what happened when it was released and what was that timeline all about. Dave, what happened?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it was a wild few days, or probably honestly a few weeks, if I'm honest. And so the short version is, so this is September of 2020. So like very much just in the middle of the pandemic. It's been kind of a wild summer, and Apple held their fall iPhone event on September 15th, which I think was a Wednesday, if I remember right, or Tuesday or a Wednesday. And in the middle of this event, they announced, hey, we're actually going to launch iOS 14 tomorrow.
Oh, God.
You're giving Federico flashbacks.
Now I'm remembering. Oh, my God. Yes.
Yeah, which was terrible for people like you and for people like me who, were expecting, they would have had the event and then they will have, announce or release the Gold Master versions of iOS 14 and maybe launch it early the following week, like a typical pattern. But nope, they said tomorrow is the day. And so that night was very frantic and trying to get Widgetsmith, Pedometer++, Sleep++, WatchSmith, all my other apps updated. And I was able to get them turned around, and they were all approved that night, and I was there for day 1 on iOS 14. And at this point, Widgetsmith was just like, I didn't think really much of the app. It was just like a thought I'd had. It's like, oh, it's kind of an extension of WatchSmith, which was an app I made for making custom watchOS complications. And it's like, oh, I may as well put it on iOS as well. Didn't really think much of it. And just kind of had a normal launch. The launch went about as I expected. It did all right. Kind of the people who knew me or knew my work talked a little bit about it. But overall, just pretty mundane, normal launch. And that weekend was my mom's 70th birthday. And so we had kind of arranged this very kind of slightly complicated quarantining individual situation so that I could see my parents, which we hadn't really seen them very much over the summer because, trying to be safe and all that. And so we'd organized it, well, we'll all kind of quarantine individually and then meet up at a beach house for my mom's 70th birthday. And so we wake up on the 18th, which was her birthday, and we were having like a nice family day, and went out for a long walk at a local nature preserve and just kind of having a nice family time. And I get back from that and just generally, mostly I was just focused on family that day, but I was like, well, let me just go and check in. Like I try in, especially the first few days after an iOS release or a big app update, to really make sure that I'm paying attention. And I went and checked into my like help desk system, and it was just going completely bonkers. Like I was getting a new email every second, basically. Like the way the help desk system works is it like live refreshes, and it was just like a waterfall of email just like pouring down the screen.
Wow.
And I was like, never seen anything like it. No idea what was going on. And was just kind of confused. And then maybe like half an hour later, someone sends me a mention on Twitter and says, hey, Widgetsmith's going like wild on TikTok. And like, I knew nothing about this. I had no idea what was going on. And then went and took a look, and there was one sort of TikTok video in particular that had started it, but then it had just kind of exploded out, and Widgetsmith was just everywhere. and it was getting downloaded just wildly, and it turned that evening, rather than being just like my mom's birthday party, into this like joint celebration of like, we had my mom's birthday party, and then like, my wife, my dad, and me are just sitting there at the kitchen table in our Airbnb, just like frantically, responding to help desk stuff. I'm releasing app updates, and it's just this kind of wild time as a result. And those first few days were just kind of wild. I think Widgetsmith had something like 50 to 60 million downloads in the first couple of weeks. And so it was just like nothing I'd ever sort of experienced before, but it was a very wild first few days in particular.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by our friends at Pillow. Lots of studies show that getting a good night's sleep can help you improve your health and well-being in lots of ways. Pillow is an app that can help you become more aware of your sleep patterns and make informed decisions to improve the quality of your sleep. All you need to do is wear your Apple Watch while you sleep. Pillow will track and analyze your sleep automatically and give you a full report. If you want to use Pillow with just an iPhone or iPad, you can do that too with the press of a button before going to bed. With an Apple Watch, you also get important information about your heart rate trend, variability, heart rate dip, and blood oxygen levels for every sleep session. You can even record sounds like sleep talking, sleep apnea, snoring, and other noises that might be disturbing your sleep. And if your Apple Watch is a Series 6 or newer, Pillow will also display information about the intensity of those sounds and give you a rating of each exposure. Another valuable aspect of Pillow is helping you make informed decisions. Pillow comes with a dedicated section where you can discover trends, personalized insights, easily compare your sleep metrics with your weight, steps, caffeine consumption, and other health metrics, and get sleep tips. If you want to wind down and relax before going to bed, Pillow also has an expanding collection of sleep aid sounds, bedtime stories, guided meditations, and music produced to help you sleep. Naps boost your productivity and focus, and if you have the chance to take one, try Pillow's Power Nap mode. Pillow can also wake you up using either your iPhone, Apple Watch, or iPad at the latest possible sleep stage using its smart alarm feature. Starting with watchOS 6, Pillow's battery consumption is also minimal. Last but not least, Pillow is privacy-minded. All of your sleep and audio data is encrypted and stored on your device and in your iCloud storage account using end-to-end encryption. You don't need to register to create an account to use Pillow. You can use it anonymously, and it doesn't collect or send your data anywhere else. Pillow is free to download from the App Store and comes with a great set of features that are free. But if you want to try Pillow's premium features, there's also an option to start a 7-day free trial. Just visit pillow.app to learn more today and get started. Again, that URL is pillow.app. Our thanks to Pillow for their support of the show.
Those were the first, as you mentioned, the first few days, right? But I remember like the app remained at the top of the charts for months to follow the iOS 14 release. Like what do you think was what was your approach there in terms of sustaining the popularity that, the app may have gone viral because of a TikTok or a bunch of YouTube videos later, but then usually that kind of content stops after a few days of the initial surprise, and yet Widgetsmith was still at the very top of the charts. What was your approach for that?
Well, I think it's a slightly tricky question. So like I'm just an indie developer. For the most part, it's just me making things. I have a couple of designers who help me, but for the most part, it's just me making my app. And most of what I did was just try and lean into the aesthetic kind of visual things that people were using the app for. So I added a bunch of like more fun colors and more fun fonts, and eventually added an aesthetic system, kind of a theming version inside the app. But I think what was weird is very much, and to this day, Widgetsmith's sort of popularity is entirely organic. Like it is just, the app still gets tens of thousands of downloads a day just from people who I imagine are just hearing about it from someone else, or they see someone else's phone and they're like, how'd you put a picture on your home screen? And someone says, oh, I just get the app called Widgetsmith, and they download it and install it. And it's just kind of grown organically ever since. Like, it's not something that I feel like I've achieved, like, personally. It's very much more just like it solves a particular problem in a very straightforward, solid way. And I think I was fortunate to be very generous with the features that the app does. Kind of like there is a premium subscription inside the app, but I'm not very, it's not a very hard paywall. Like, the vast majority of the features everyone can use. And I think that sort of, rather than trying to take people's money from the paywall, I'm using that as free marketing, like by allowing people to use the app to its fullest, or to, almost to its fullest, without giving me anything. And that means that it can just sort of naturally share and spread amongst my user base.
How has the app changed, Dave's, in terms of what you originally conceived of it as to what it is today? Because you mentioned things like theming, adding more colors and fonts and things like that. I know, having been on the beta before it originally launched, I feel like it was more of a, I suppose, you were focused maybe a little more on the utility aspect of the app, although that's still a big part of it today. I mean, what's kind of the mix? How has the mix changed over time?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing that's different now is what it turned out, what people really, really liked was photos, and putting photos on their home screen. Like, I think that by far the number one use case for the app is people have a particular picture that they want to put in a particular place on their home screen. And that is probably 60-70% of the widgets out there are just that simple, basic widget that it's just, they have a picture, they want to be in a particular place. And I think what I've done with the app is made it so that is the easy, straightforward, like, if that's all you want, I made it so that it's like 3 taps inside the app and you can have a photo widget. And then I've built out features around that in terms of like doing image filters and borders and things like along those lines. And with iOS 16, I did image segmentation. So if you want to isolate people for lock screen or home screen widgets, you can do that now, or you can drag and drop segmented images out of the Photos app. But I think that is an area that when I first built the app, I almost didn't even have any photo widgets in there. Like, they didn't exist in the, in Widgetsmith on iOS on watchOS at that point.
Right.
And so I was like, maybe I'll add something like kind of mirroring the Apple Photos widgets, which like it cycles through pictures. Initially, all I had was a photo album widget that would cycle through photos in an album. And I had all these people saying, they're creating albums with one picture in it for the purpose of putting a single picture on their home screen. And so like the very first app update I did, after I kind of put out some like, crashing bugs and things that all of a sudden when you have millions of users, you discover, like the very first feature was a single photo widget, which is one of the slightly funny things, because I think I built that feature in like a couple of hours and put it out there, and then it's been used, hundreds of millions of times. And so there's definitely some technical debt that I'm still kind of like carrying around as a result, because it was not the most thoroughly thought through feature, if I'm being completely honest.
I'm guessing that it must have been a learning experience for you to go from, and I mean, no offense, John, right? But we're not regular people, like folks like you and I, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
And over the past few years, like, you've been building these utilities mostly targeted at people like us, like people who know their way around apps and settings and tweaking things, like a more niche audience, maybe. Yeah. And I'm guessing that for you, David, must have been a learning opportunity to be confronted with the masses, or like this avalanche of regular people with a different kind of knowledge, with different sensibilities, with different priorities in terms of what they want from an app, right?
Yeah. And I think it has definitely been instructive and taught me a lot about user interface design, and the importance of not making any assumptions and not making something that assumes a level of sophistication. And like adding things like help. Like I have help videos and frequently asked questions and walkthroughs and all these types of other things that I don't have in a lot of my other apps because they're just not as necessary, or I don't feel like they're as necessary. But when you start to build something that is very widely used, it becomes very clear that, trying to be clever and trying to be cute and, having lots of like, cool UI with hidden animation, with hidden features that if you long press here, you do this. It's like, it just won't work. You need it to be very straightforward, nice, like big, obvious buttons and things and how you do this. And I mean, even with the last in Widgetsmith 4, which I just released, like I completely redesigned the editor because I was finding that the old one was just a little bit too complicated and was a little bit obtuse if you didn't know what you were doing. And so like the new editor is very much structured around, I want to make everything big and clear and straightforward and put lots of like big handles on things so it's easy to do and anybody can do it. It's not something that requires like precision work or really like making any assumptions about you as a user. And I feel like I'm a much better developer as a result of this experience, that there's a certain funness to working on things that are kind of geeky and really targeted at a niche audience because you can really get in the weeds and go after certain things. But there's definitely something more challenging in a lot of ways to make something broad and accessible and, work for anybody from, I have a lot of, it's like sort of kids, high schoolers, college kids using it through to lots of, I have many emails I get from people who are, it's like grandparents putting, pictures of their grandkids on their phone. And I want an app that works across all of that in terms of their technical and life experience.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Masterclass. With Masterclass, you can learn from the world's best minds, anytime, anywhere, and at your own pace. With over 150 classes from a range of world-class instructors in 11 different categories, that thing you've always wanted to do is closer than you think. You can learn the art of negotiating with Chris Voss, improve your culinary skills with Mexican Cooking by Gabriela Camara, learn about disruptive entrepreneurship from Richard Branson, or learn how to make a compelling video that will go viral with Marquez Brownlee. Masterclass is a lot of fun. I've been taking a storytelling class by Neil Gaiman, and it's been fantastic. You may wonder that as someone who writes nonfiction, why I take a fiction writing class. Well, you see, all writing has an element of storytelling, even writing about the latest Apple tech, and I wanted to get the perspective of a writer whose work I respect and apply some of those lessons from his experience to my own. The class has been fantastic because it covers both the practical and theoretical parts of writing. There's lots of great nuts and bolts advice on how to write, as well as more philosophical topics that were really thought-provoking. One of my favorite parts came very early in Gaiman's lessons with a story about how he was walking in the woods with his kids and was attacked by a swarm of yellow jackets and how it gave him insights into writing the novel Coraline. Learning new things is why I enjoy writing about technology so much, and I bet there are a lot of listeners of this show who feel the same way. I highly recommend you check it out. Get unlimited access to every class. And as an App Stories listener, you'll get 15% off an annual membership. Just go to masterclass.com/appstories today. That's masterclass.com/appstories. Our thanks to Masterclass for their support of the show. Dave, let's move on to the current version of Widgetsmith and in particular Lock Screen Widgets. You mentioned a little bit ago about how you redesigned the editor to make it easier for people to create widgets. What kind of things did you add to take advantage of iOS 16's new Lock Screen Widget system?
Yeah, so it was certainly interesting when iOS 16 was announced because, like, okay, so widgets didn't get really any attention in iOS 15, which was a little bit worrying as someone who, like, cares a lot about widgets. But it seems like they were just waiting to have, lock screen widgets ready in 16. And so, certainly it was nice for me to have a very clear marching order for the rest of the summer, because like, all right, I'm going to take as full advantage of this as I possibly can. And so, Widgetsmith on day one had as many different kinds of, round, rectangular, and text-based widgets as I could think of. So, you can put pictures and weather and text and quotes and tide data and all kinds of things on your home screen. And I think it also became something very clear that it's interesting the way that Apple structured the lock screen widgets, because they're all monochrome and kind of this frosted look. And so that was part of the motivation why I did image segmentation stuff, because I found that if you want to put a picture in one of your lock screen widgets, it's very easy for it to get kind of just overwhelmed by its background. But if you isolate it on just a person, like a person's face, or an animal, like you have a dog or a cat or something like that, and you isolate just their face, you end up with a much nicer, much more compelling, thing that actually looks good on your lock screen, rather than just being this kind of muddy, frosted mess.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that when I first saw what you were doing with the photo widgets, I thought, I don't know, who's gonna use these? And then, of course, like that turned out to be, I think, a very common use case, because it seems obvious to me now that the more ways you give people to customize their devices with pictures of loved ones or animals or cartoon characters or whatever, that technology is flexible enough to give them the opportunity to do that. And so I continue to find it so fascinating how you are designing for this wider audience that, as you mentioned, like it's so much trickier to build an app for that kind of audience than to build an app for a geeky audience. And I see a reflection of that when I do my annual iOS review, and sort of the goal that I've set for myself over the past few years of trying to make the review more approachable is a lot more challenging and time-consuming than to just say, you know what, I'm going to write a technical Bible that's, 50 pages long, and I'm going to use all the technical jargon that I know. That's easy for me because I can just sit down and write all these fancy technical terms. But having to slim that down and make it friendlier, more approachable, and human readable, a lot more difficult than doing the geeky approach. So I can relate to what you mentioned, I guess.
Yeah. No, and it's definitely just one of those realities. And I think it's weird too, as an independent developer, building something that is going to have such a wide use on day one. Like, it's one thing to launch something and to have maybe a few hundred, a few thousand, maybe if you're lucky, a few tens of thousands of people use it on day one. Whereas, Widgetsmith, it's measured in millions instead, which is, lovely and certainly something I feel very fortunate to have. But it's really challenging when you do any of these kind of features and you just don't know how it's going to go. And if you go the wrong way, like, you could have a whole lot of email very quickly if you make a mistake, or you you do something wrong, or you create a confusion, like if I implemented things in a way that didn't quite work. And so it definitely takes up the level of thoughtfulness and the level of care and testing that I feel like I have to do to make sure things are going to work right.
Yeah. Dave, I was wondering about the development process for lock screen widgets. How does it kind of fit in the entire ecosystem, from watch complications to home screen widgets to the lock screen widgets? How has Apple done this, and has it been successful for someone like you who's working on all three kinds of widgets?
Yeah, so in a strange way, I'd say the way they did lock screen widgets in some ways takes Widgetsmith back to its origins of being WatchSmith, which was an app that about making complications on watchOS. Because, even technically at the low level, Apple has essentially implemented lock screen widgets as though they were complications. Like, there's a few minor technical differences, but pretty much, these, and you could even run the same lock screen widget code on a watchOS app and have it work on watchOS 9. And so they've definitely taken and they're reusing something that I think was fairly well proven. And I would say, in my experience, it's worked well as a result in terms of from a technical perspective. It's like there's a part of me that feels frustrated by it, in so far as it's there's a lot of limitations that the size and lack of color and the image processing that happens on these widgets. That means there's a lot of things that I could make or that people have asked for that I just can't do. And it's just like, well, this is what we are. We have, it's a circle, it's a rectangle, or it's a line of text above your time, and that's it. And I think that limitation isn't a technical limitation, but it's sort of a platform decision that Apple's made that I found a little bit frustrating and limiting. But technically, it's very much the complication system that I've been building apps for and against for a long time. And a lot of I even was able to take a lot of the design elements and logic that I've built up over the years for my watch complications and just ported it directly over into Widgetsmith now, because it's surprisingly difficult to put content inside of a circle and have it look good, especially like text things and making it so that if you make it too wide, then it'll overlap the circle, but you need to work out how far you are away from the center of the circles to work out when you get clipped. And there's a lot of really nuanced stuff there that it's kind of frustrating that I'm not sure why it's a circle rather than a square. I get that it means that they can share the same exact sort of families between the lock screen and watchOS, where we are used to having circular complications, but it definitely has made my life much more challenging to have circles rather than squares for kind of no particular reason on a giant, on a 14 Pro Max. There's plenty of space. There's no need for this to be this little rounded off circle, but that's what they've done.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some developers struggle with those circular widgets. There's really not a lot of space there, and it does seem really tough to fit it in there in a way that looks like it's at home, as opposed to just kind of crammed in there in kind of an odd way. What are some of those things that you mentioned that you'd like to be able to do with lock screen widgets, but you really can't right now?
Yeah, and I think, a lot of this is based on just the feedback I've gotten from my users. And I think the biggest thing is I think people wish they could make them bigger. And a lot of this is just the same kind of thing. If you want to make a widget that has someone's face on it, it's very small right now. You're talking about maybe it's like a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, or if you use the rectangular one, it's like a 1/2 inch by 1.5 inches or something. And it feels a bit pointless in that when they have this big space that most of the time is completely empty, that there aren't any bigger ones. And I think I also hear from people that they wish they could put color onto their lock screen in a way that, Apple, I get what they're doing insofar as they're taking color and making it a global thing for your lock screen, so that if you apply a tint color or use one of the toning filters and things, it applies to all your widgets, which sort of makes sense to some degree, but also it's well, it's my lock screen. Why can't I choose what goes where? And if I want it to be, full color, and it reminds me a lot of on watchOS, where several of the watch faces have the multicolor mode, where you can choose a tint color and it applies globally, or you can say, I want this to be full color, in which case go ahead and just show all the colors. And I think I hear a lot of people that those two things, having size and color, would just expand the range of situations where it would be a kind of the way that they could be creative and the way that they could make their lock screen look a bit more specific. And especially originally I thought that they'd gone the monochrome route because of how they were going to be doing their always on display on the Pro models. But in the end, we still have color, or at least it's muted color, but there is still color on there. So it isn't they need it to be monochrome because in always on mode, it's just going to be completely black with, gray text or something. It's they didn't go down that road. There is still some color there. So I don't know why they were so, so restrictive in the first place.
Yeah, and it's so odd considering how most of the lock screen widgets that we've seen so far are using SF symbols for the glyphs that you see on the lock screen. And a lot of the modern symbols that Apple provides developers come with these different rendering modes, right? So you can have symbols that are multicolor by default, you don't even have to do it yourself. So I would have liked to see a multicolor option, just like you see that on the watch with some of the modular faces, right? So Apple takes care of the color for you, or you can just say, I want to have a consistent color that applies to all the elements on this lock screen. So I do think they have a better sort of framework for colors and personalization on the watch still, where you have all those different options for colors, but they don't have it on the iPhone, which is odd. I wanted to ask you about something that is upcoming in 16.1, live activities, right? So we have this sort of hybrid of notifications that look like expanded widgets, and Apple has been advertising them as obviously targeted towards apps that have real-time data or deal with some kind of real-time push notification to tell you, hey, something is ongoing, keep an eye on this live activity. But I've been keeping an eye on Twitter, and I see, indie developers, of course, you give them these constraints,
Right.
and they can come up with all kinds of wild and creative implementations of this technology. Are you looking at live activities yourself?
I am, though not for the core functionality of something like Widgetsmith, because I think one of the big limitations of them is they have to be user initiated. And they only last for a limited amount of time. I think it's 8 hours. If there's like the longest you could have.
I think 8 is the longest. Yeah.
Yeah. And which is, I think, makes sense broadly. Like I understand it as a limitation. But there are scenarios and things that I could imagine that a live activity would make sense in. But in a lot of ways, this is in some ways me just being like, I wish I could put home screen widgets on the lock screen. And have a bit more space, be able to like show someone's calendar. And as you go through the day, have it, use all of that space that you have for a live activity to show more compelling data. But the way that live activities are structured, it's not really a good use for that. Like my current main use that I have in mind is I'm working on a mode in my step counting app that's going to be kind of like an iPhone workout app for tracking walks and hikes. And that context makes a lot of sense for something like a live activity where you could start your walk and I can show you, your distance traveled and a map and speed and metrics and stuff like that on your lock screen, which would be, a very exciting kind of nice thing that previously I think only, Apple Maps' turn-by-turn directions was able to do before. And so the fact that the rest of us can do something like that now is very cool, but I think the utility of live activities is fairly niche as a result. And I mean, maybe someone will be more creative than I am, but that's my initial read so far is that, it's really targeted at very specific kind of data cases where the user is going to do something and then for a, short period of time thereafter, they're going to want to monitor that activity over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Trade Coffee. Every day is precious, and we should all make the most of every single one of them. They shouldn't start with a mediocre grocery store coffee. You deserve to start your day with the best coffee you can make at home from Trade Coffee. Trade Coffee is a coffee subscription service unlike anything you've ever tried before, because they partner with top independent roasters to freshly roast and send the best coffees in the country direct to your home on your preferred schedule. Your trade experience can be as simple or sophisticated as you want. You can quickly select from curated collections by roast, flavor profile, brewing method, and more. Their team of experts do all the hard work, taste testing hundreds of coffees from across the U.S. every single month to curate over 450 exceptional coffees that make the cut. Or if you want something curated just for you, then take a minute and complete Trade's coffee questionnaire. You'll be expertly matched with a perfect coffee, and a fresh bag of beans will be on its way. I love Trade Coffee. It's perfect for starting your day. I like to get up in the morning, brew myself a cup or two of coffee, and catch up on the overnight news. With Trade Coffee, I've been able to find a wide variety of roasteries that have exactly the kind of coffee that I like. I really like a dark, rich, chocolatey flavor. That's just my personal taste. But with Trade Coffee, I can find exactly that. And if you like something else, you can find that too. Trade is the easiest way to get the very best coffee delivered fresh when you need it. And you've got nothing to lose because Trade guarantees you'll love your first bag. And if not, they'll work with you to replace it for free. So, if you want to support small businesses and brew the best cup of coffee you've ever made at home, it's time to try Trade Coffee. Right now, Trade is offering our listeners a total of $30 off your first order, plus free shipping at drinktrade.com/appstories. That's drinktrade.com/appstories for $30 off your subscription to the best coffee in the country. Our thanks to Trade Coffee for their support of the show. Dave, I wanted to switch gears a little bit with you and talk a little bit about the iPhone 14 Pro and photography, because you were recently in the Scottish Highlands and you on your website you published a bunch of really beautiful photos, and I wanted to get your take on those cameras. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean it's amazing. So like I went on a trip to the Scottish Highlands primarily to test the Apple Watch Ultra, and to kind of explore that as a developer and also just as an avid hiker and backpacker. But also, it's like I recorded a vlog about that trip using my iPhone 14 Pro's, cameras for that. And then also, I was really intrigued as a landscape photographer, like using a 48 megapixel sensor. What does that get us? Like, if for day-to-day snapshot stuff, it's, does the pixel binning and turns it into a 12 megapixel image, that's probably looks better. But in a situation like when you're taking big landscape pictures, having more detail is usually what you want. But as a photographer, it was just amazing to have that resolution. And so I think the most fascinating thing to me was a few times I took multi-photograph panoramas. So like rather than using just the panoramic mode in the app, I took just regular standard pictures and just slightly moved the camera between them, and then took them into Photoshop and merged them together. And I think my biggest one is 167 megapixels as a result,
wow,
which is gigantic. Like I'm sitting in front of a Pro Display XDR and I loaded on that, and it's still probably scaled down by like 3 times, and I can zoom dramatically in, see like tiny little details on trees and things that are, miles away from me. And it was just really cool to have that kind of resolution available. And fair enough, you have to shoot them in RAW and you have to jump through some hoops to get there. But I would say the camera system for that kind of shooting was amazing. Like it was just really fun to have that level of detail possible, from just a phone that I could handheld and take snapshots and do pictures with. And, it was immediately added into iCloud and all the things that are great about taking photos on your phone versus, if I'd taken out, I have a big, Sony DSLR that I sometimes go into the field with, but it's always such a fuss. Whereas this was, no fuss at all. And other than these files being gigantic and, kind of being interesting, if I'm going to leave them in my iCloud photo library because I took, several hundred 48 megapixel raw images and several hours of 4K HDR video on this trip, like that I'm still working on, but the actual quality of the result was just amazing and so easy to do.
Yeah, I suspect that that's probably why Apple has kind of somewhat hidden some of these settings in the camera settings that, by default, you're not going to be shooting in 48 pixel RAW, but the option is there. And I think some of the pro camera apps too do a really nice job of making those options maybe a little more accessible. Things like halide in particular is what I'm thinking about. Do you have any tips for anybody after having spent a few days taking those photos and videos? Any tips for listeners about how to approach some of these new formats that are available?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I would say is to be flexible about which lens you use and try the same sort of the same scene with a bunch of different with a bunch of the different lenses, because it's this strange thing, and Apple does this initially where if you take a 1x picture, now there's also a 2x, which is just a zoom in, essentially a crop of that 1x, and then there's 3x, which is actually the telephoto. And I think there's enough resolution in the 1x image that a lot of times what I found is even if I was expecting to sort of zoom in on a particular part of the region, I just took a 1x picture and then jumped into one of the zoomed images, and often found that the crop was actually better because it meant that I had the flexibility after the fact to adjust the crop exactly how I wanted, rather than if I go straight to the 3x camera or the 2x, it meant that if I slightly misframed the picture and I wish I had, gone slightly wider or shifted it ever so slightly, I didn't have that flexibility,
Right.
in post. Whereas if the sort of the workflow I got into that I seemed to work pretty well is I would see a scene that I like, I would pull it out and take a 1x picture right away, and then I would play around with the other lenses to kind of work out if there was a better one. And sometimes the better picture came out of the 3x, but I liked having kind of the safety blanket of having the big 48 megapixel image that if later I wanted to crop into or frame in a particular way, I had the option to do so.
So you mentioned going on this trip to test the Apple Watch Ultra, and I want to talk about that for a few minutes.
Sure.
So this Apple Watch Ultra, designed for those who like adventures, explorers, people who are into extreme sports. You're not new to doing these hikes, right?
No.
And exploring and going out there in the wilderness. How was it with the Apple Watch Ultra?
Yeah. And so it's like my background is I've been doing it. I love hiking, and especially like backcountry hiking. I love nothing more than just like spending a day essentially just by myself in the wilderness. Like where if I see no other person all day, I'm happy as can be. Like I love that experience. And I've gone on several trips like that and, taken an Apple Watch with me, and a traditional Apple Watch works all right in a lot of those circumstances, but I definitely feel like I'm pushing it outside of where it's comfortable. Like very often I'm doing like 15, 20, 22, 24 mile days where you can just about track that on like a Series 7 Apple Watch, at least with what, the earlier versions of watchOS, but it really was pushing it. And so when Apple announced an Apple Watch that can do more and was kind of more geared towards that, I mean, it was perfect for me, and I was super excited to take it out on this trip. And so this trip I did 3 days and about 61 miles, and tracked it all with the Ultra. Did a bunch of comparisons between I have a Coros like sports specific adventure watch, compared it to a Series 7 Apple Watch, and like the high level version is I love this watch. I think it is perfect for so many people, because what Apple did is they didn't make a adventure watch and make the Apple version of that. They didn't make the Apple version of like a Garmin Enduro, or like I have a Coros Apex Pro, which are these very specific devices that with weird screens and strange interaction models and really limited things. But as a result, they have very long battery life and those kind of behaviors. It's like what instead Apple did is they took an Apple Watch, which is amazingly useful and can do so much, and they pushed it out. Like they gave it more of a rugged design, made it have longer battery life, and added a few little features that make it better in that context. But they retained 100% of what being an Apple Watch is. Like they didn't compromise at all on what makes an Apple Watch great. And I think that was just incredible to see, that it was like, this is still an Apple Watch. It can, like I paid for, my train journey on the way up to Scotland with my Apple Watch. I made a phone call on my Apple Watch. I sent text messages on my Apple Watch. I did all those things. And then it's the same device that I can go out into the wilderness and use for my maps and navigation. And, I tested out some of the safety features on it, like the siren and things, and it can do all those. But I'm so excited that they went that direction rather than trying to make this very niche, very specific device that doesn't perform well in day-to-day life, which is like a Garmin or a Coros or a Sunto or one of those watches. Instead, they made a device that works great in day-to-day life, but is capable of being off and doing more. And it reminds me a lot of, it's almost like Apple made with the Ultra, they made a pickup truck, which is still something, it's still just like a car. Like you can drive it on the regular roads. You can take your kids to school in it. You can do normal day-to-day stuff, but you could also throw gravel in the back and, go off-roading on it. And they retained enough of that day-to-day utility that they didn't have to compromise. Whereas if they'd made something that was, like a really sports-specific watch, it's like they could have made a dump truck, which could for sure carry more gravel. You could put way more in a dump truck than you could in a pickup truck. That is completely true, but a dump truck is kind of useless in so many other ways.
Right.
And so I'm glad that instead they, rather than making a car, they made a pickup truck, and it's so useful as a result. And so like, I'm in love with it. It's amazing. It's the perfect device for me. And like, I have some nitpicks about some software choices they made, but overall, I think it's like a perfect version 1, and, it'll be on my wrist for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, Dave, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because the Apple Watch to me is fascinating. When it launched, Apple seemed to really want to push the fashion angle. I mean, they had a gold watch after all that cost, $10,000. But over time, it's really evolved into, something different, really. I mean, something where the fitness and health aspects of it have taken on a much greater role, and also things like notifications and other everyday type things that just kind of help take you away from your phone when you don't need it. And in a way, to me, this feels like the Ultra might be the ultimate manifestation of what the Apple Watch has evolved into. It's the most Apple Watch of any Apple Watch we have, because it's really found its footing and found its identity. And this is just that, but more in all different respects, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to ask, though, I mean, it is big, and I want to get a sense from you what it was like wearing it all day long. And also, I assume maybe sleep tracking with it if you were doing that as well.
I mean, I will say it's large, but I found it very comfortable. Like, I think it's big, but not heavy. It's because it's made of titanium. Mm-hmm. It's not, it doesn't feel any different than any of the other watches, that, Apple Watches that I've worn, or even some of the, like my, sports specific watch, which is big and chunky. Like, it feels very comfortable. It feels well weighted. Like, the size of it, if anything, it was more just like really nice to have a big screen that, like, when I'm out walking in the Highlands and it's pouring rain and foggy and all this, I have this giant screen that I can look at to, see a map or see my navigation. And it was really cool to have a big screen for that, in a way that made it much more glanceable, which I wasn't necessarily expecting to be the case. Like, coming from a 45 millimeter watch, I wasn't sure that those 4 millimeters would make a difference, but it really is cool. And it feels like I have like it's almost like I have a baby iPhone on my wrist in some ways, like the amount of information that you can, put on there, and how bright the display is, and all of those things. So I found it perfectly comfortable to wear, and like having the giant screen was great. Like, I had no complaints on it. And I mean, it reminds me a lot of the discussion people would have around iPhones, and why, the Max phones are so popular, because having a big screen is so often just better, as long as it's practical and can fit into your life and your pockets and situation. And in this case, at least for my wrist, which is not particularly large, I found that it was comfortable and worked really well.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Yeah, I think that, a big bright screens, there's a lot to be said for them. And I think one of the things that a lot of the reviews and photos don't necessarily bring out is how bright that screen really is, because it's, I think, 2000 nits, which
it is.
Right. So no matter what kind of sunny day you're out in, you should be able to see that without any problem, I would think.
Yeah, no, I had no problem with legibility, and it even looks really well because it's a flat edge screen rather than the rounded ones, and so it feels almost slightly bigger as a result, because it doesn't feel like the screen is falling away from you. It's like the whole screen is like up and flat and in your face, which, it was just super easy to read. And which in a lot of contexts, like what I'm doing is I want to be able to just glance down at my wrist, get some information, and then keep moving. In a way that I don't want to have to stop and squint and hold it up to my eyes and do that kind of thing. I want to be able to just glance at it, and having a big bright screen was perfect for that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Dave, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really fun talking to you all about widgets and Widgetsmith, as well as the photography and the iPhone 14 Pro and the Apple Watch Ultra. All really interesting, fascinating stuff. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank our 3 sponsors again for this episode. That's Pillow, Masterclass, and Trade. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net. Dave, where can people find you?
On Twitter at _DavidSmith or david-smith.org, or go to the App Store and search for Widgetsmith.
Excellent, excellent. We'll have links to all of Dave's stuff in the show notes as well. And, of course, Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.